Welcome to the Hangin with Gannon podcast, episode 2. I'm Pat Gannon, your host, and with 26 years of helping families secure their dream homes through intelligent financing. Today, I'm sitting down with someone who's become a legend in our market, Brad Kappel, who's a top 100 Sotheby's agent worldwide, #1 waterfront agent in Anne Arundel County. He also has the highest sale in Anne Arundel County and the highest waterfront sale in Maryland at a purchase price of $17.5 million. Welcome to the podcast, Brad.
Thanks for having me, Pat.
All right, I always like to find out a little bit more about what I call someone in real estate's origin story. You know, maybe find out a little bit about your background, how you grew up, and then how that transitioned you into real estate.
Great question. So I mentioned earlier I was born in Annapolis, grew up here, grew up on the water, and obviously went off to college and came back. My father had started some businesses, one of which was Annapolis Seafood Market. Worked in those markets growing up, and came back, and he had taken over a restaurant. So I started working in the restaurant and became head chef. I worked there for about 4 years and realized I didn't want to work every night, weekend, and holiday. Neither did my wife want me to work those days. So I jumped into the radio business, and I was selling radio advertising here in Annapolis, met a lot of business owners. And then I bought a house and sold a house with a local realtor, and he said, hey, you'd be good for real estate. And this was back in the end of 2008. So this is my 17th year in the business. And, started in the bottom of the global financial crisis. And I remember people saying, well, if you can make it now, you can make it anytime. And everything was for sale and nobody was buying. And I rode that market, up to where we are now. So it's been a great journey, and I've, built a war chest of, skills, and I've had a lot of, challenges that I've overcome in the turbidity of the market.
Sure. Yeah. It's funny that you said that you got out of the restaurant business to avoid evenings and weekends, and I'm sure, right? I'm sure you're doing some of that.
Yeah. Now I just work 24/7.
Right. It didn't, but. That's excellent. I know in the past, too, we've kind of talked about, you do have some background in some home construction and renovation.
Yeah. So I've had a kind of a real diverse background. My father was extremely handy, and he did a lot of the work himself around the businesses and at home. And then right after college, my 2 summers, I spent on a framing crew, which is the hardest job I've ever had, framing residential homes. And then I took a break from real estate at one point, and I was vice president of a contracting company where we did estimating and, all types of projects like, small renovations, bathrooms, kitchens. And I got to bid those jobs and then hire the crews and manage the crews. So, and then, over the last 17 years of working in the business, I've worked with a lot of civil engineers, architects. I've got to help clients find properties and watch them build their dream home, and I shepherded the process. So, it's there's a lot to know, and I think, when you're hiring an expert to, represent you, you need to have a lot of skills that you bring to the table.
Yeah, I mean that's amazing. I mean, I think it's invaluable to be able to really advise clients that way. It's really incredible. When it comes to waterfront buying. What are some, maybe if someone's looking at their first waterfront home, what's a misconception, or what are some misconceptions out there that buyers don't realize when they come to you, when they talk about waterfront properties?
That's probably one of the most important factors, I think, when you thinking about residential property. The average homeowner, buys a condo, a townhouse, a single family home, and a subdivision. Waterfront properties are completely different because you're buying something that has a lifestyle factor. It has inherent risk by living by the water. And then you have to really determine, what's your use? How are you going to use the property? And then, what type of property is going to, meet your needs? So, if you think about a sailboat, right? If somebody owns a sailboat, they may not want to buy a property that's upriver from a bridge because they won't be able to get the boat out to the open water. So each waterfront property has, pros and cons, nuances. Do you need a deep water dock? Are you concerned about flood elevation and global warming? Do you want to be, close to the water because you have mobility issues and you don't want to have a lot of stairs? There's privacy is a big component with waterfront. So having a local expert that lives the lifestyle, and growing up on the water, there's so much that I've learned about how to enjoy a property and also what to avoid risk-wise.
Well, I think about that. The questions that I think I would ask an agent, those are things that are totally different than something inland.
Right.
The things that I wouldn't even think of all those things, but Yeah, you're spending a lot of money to buy a home on the water like that, and it can be an expensive mistake if it doesn't match what you want to do, what the things that you want to enjoy with the water, and making that. So your knowledge really helps with that. You mentioned, some of the stuff that's weather related,
Right.
Rising water levels, global warming concerns. When a client brings that up, what's some of the advice that you give, and have you seen that affect any of the appreciation with the properties, or is there any sort of buyer hesitancy related to that?
Yeah, the 2003 was Hurricane Isabel, and that was the most significant hurricane that ever hit our coast here since Hazel back in '54. So that reset the FEMA flood maps, the 100-year flood maps for the Anne Arundel County area. And so they pushed, that was a 7-foot tidal surge. And so after 2003, a lot of the docks got destroyed. A lot of people started to really pay attention to elevation. And I've seen just in the past few years, a lot of the docks, the private docks that are on the various tributaries are now flooding. The water's going over the top of the docks. So the current code in the county is actually allowing people to raise their docks up higher. So if you're coming from the city often, which a lot of our buyers come from the DMV, DC, Montgomery County, Northern Virginia, they tend to be more concerned about global warming, and because they didn't live and grow up here. I can tell that we haven't had a lot of sea level rise, in my lifetime, but it's enough to be concerned. And if you buy a property that is very close to the water, where the house sits within 9 feet of the elevation, where the tide meets the shore, then you definitely need to have flood insurance. You need to pay attention to the storms. You need to consider where your living space is in relation to the flood height. So that affects the saleability of a property and the long-term appreciation, because a lot of clients that call me say, I don't want to be low to the water. I want to be out of the floodplain. And if you show them something that's, let's say, at 20-foot elevation, they still feel it may be in the floodplain, although you could point out, hey, the highest storm ever was 7 feet. Mm-hmm. And the Naval Academy sits at 6 feet above floodplain, right? So if it was 20 feet, it would annihilate all of downtown Annapolis and the Naval Academy. It's highly unlikely. Right. So yeah, elevation is a key factor for value, for sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
I mean, that's something that I know when I have a client that comes to me asking about mortgage numbers. Right. The first question that I ask when it comes to a waterfront property is, do you know if it's in a flood zone?
Right.
And if they don't know whether that's the case, I'm like, you should be starting there. You need to find that out, because that's obviously impactful for your potential monthly payment. And anytime they want to see those numbers, I'll say, listen, I can give you some numbers to look at, but you should investigate if it is in a flood zone, what that looks like, because that can really range from very little, depending on the elevation and other factors, to extremely high. And I always don't want them to expect, I don't want any surprises. Yeah. And so those are things that I talk about just from the lending side. So I'm glad you brought that up. You touched on an area that you talked about, the DMV, people coming from outside of Anne Arundel County to purchase here. I assume that a lot of that's been helped through remote working. Through COVID has changed the game a little bit for people that are buying in this area. Is that what we're seeing? And I'm assuming you're probably even seeing outside of here, New York City, other big cities where people have decided, hey, I can still do my job where I'm doing it, but also live the waterfront lifestyle here. Is that, do you work with a lot of clients, I assume?
So I think, I've got a bank of knowledge looking at the last 17 years and seeing where the buyers have come from. The pandemic COVID market influence was completely different than what I saw up until 2020. So 2020, up till that point was primarily the DMV, early retirees, the busy, kind of families that wanted to have an escape on the water, and they were moving here, buying a second home, retiring to the Annapolis area. We didn't have a lot of regional buyers. It was mostly just this DMV local market. COVID put Annapolis and Eastern Shore on the table because it was a place people could drive to from New York. There's a tremendous amount of value in this area in comparison to places like Greenwich or Block Island or the Hamptons. What we've seen is buyers now are coming in from all over. I mean, they're coming from California is very common. We sold 2 homes this week to buyers from out of state, one from California and one from Florida that moved to Florida during the pandemic and now moved back. And we do track our data very closely. And so last year we had about, I think it was like 65% of our buyers came in from out of the county.
Okay.
Because a lot of people want to know, hey, is somebody moving from, Arnold to Annapolis? Or are they moving from off the water to on the water? And only about a third of the buyers are actually local buyers.
Interesting.
So what's interesting is in our market, there's very low inventory at any time with waterfront, and it's a scarce commodity, and there's no new developments and there's no new land that can be developed. So if you think about 2/3 of the waterfront transactions this year are likely going to be bought by people from out of state, that's setting up a scarcity for a long time for waterfront, which really helps to keep the values going up.
Okay. So let's maybe talk about some specific examples. If I'm a buyer that's thinking about buying their first waterfront home, I'm probably in that entry level price point. What's an entry level price point look like? I know obviously you're very general. And then where am I looking? Am I looking in the Annapolis area? Is it the Eastern Shore? Where are you directing me to consider making my first waterfront purchase?
Well, I think the first thing we have to, define is what waterfront is, right? So waterfront means that you have riparian rights, and those are rights that convey with the deed that mean you have exclusive egress to the water, that you own your water frontage, and it therefore provides the right to have a dock that's yours private, and you'll hear people say they bought a waterfront property, and often maybe they just have a view of the water, but they don't own the water frontage. The most valuable and most expensive waterfront properties are waterfront properties that have the full riparian rights. And if a buyer's value driven and they're looking to get on the water, and they would be on the peripheral areas like Pasadena, Deal, Shady Side, and then Kent Island. That's where the value is. You get closer to the city center in downtown Annapolis. We just put a property under contract there for $11 million, on Spa Creek. That's where you're going to find the most expensive properties. And then, as you get into all the components, then the way I think that what I've found that buyers, when they're analyzing value, the hardest, thing for them to wrap their heads around is that with a waterfront property, the land is typically going to be, 2/3 of the value of the property. If you're buying a nice piece of waterfront. So if you're buying a home for $1.5 million, the land should be $1 million.
Got it.
Right? The house is $500,000. So 10 years from now, when you go to sell that property, the land will continue to appreciate over 10 years, and the house will probably depreciate, right? The structure.
Right.
So the biggest mistake you can make as a buyer is to buy a really nice house on a poor lot, right? On a C grade lot, because you're paying $1 million for the structure and $500,000 for the house, for the land. Versus if you buy an old cottage on a beautiful lot, you can continue to improve the home or tear it down and build a new home, and the value will be there long term. So, when you look at a standard home in a subdivision, the land's, on $1 million house in a regular subdivision, the land's probably $200,000 and the house is $800,000. If you go to the water and you look at $1 million house, the land could be $700,000-800,000 and the structure is $300,000.
Right.
That's the biggest difference. So until you get to $2 or $3 million, that's where you get a really nice lot with a really nice structure.
Got it.
So something has to give if you're down around $1 million or so. You're either going to get a nice house on a okay lot, or you're going to get a really nice lot with an older structure or a small home.
That's interesting, and that was actually what I was going to ask you next about comparison of appreciation versus waterfront versus inland. So I think you kind of answered that question.
Yeah.
So that's more of a focus that you have. So you'd say you have more of a focus of land-driven evaluations on the waterfront than you would in something that's inland, as far as making your recommendations.
Yeah, I always think with when I'm speaking to buyers, I use a lot of analogies, and one of them, I always think of waterfront properties as kind of the quintessential Porsche 911, right?
Okay.
You can buy all types of sports cars, but a Porsche 911 has one of the highest resale values of all brands, and there's a cult following for that particular type of car, and there's 50 years of those cars, and some are in great condition, some have a lot of miles, but they're all holding their value, and they're all continuing. Waterfront is much like that. If you buy a waterfront property, it's like a blue chip stock. As long as you don't buy something in the swamp or something that floods or doesn't have the rights to the water, it's going to continue to appreciate at a more rapid rate than a standard non-waterfront property, just because of the scarcity of it, like a 911.
Now, Brad, being as part of, we talked about this a little bit, that you're a top 100 Sotheby's agent worldwide. How would you say being part of Sotheby's helps you do what's best for your clients? I know that Sotheby's is in 70 countries, has the auction house nationwide. Talk to me a little bit about how the Sotheby's influence helps your clients.
It's another analogy for you. I always say that, the Sotheby's flag goes a little higher on the flagpole, and that's because we have a global platform. We're the only luxury brokerage in the world that has, offices in over 70 countries, over 25,000, premium level agents. So I, am able to, basically have a megaphone to the world. So when you list a property, I can expose it worldwide. And the better exposure, the higher the sales price, the better the terms. It's a better, end result for my clientele. And then also we have such a great white glove level of service where if you said, Brad, I want you to sell my house in Annapolis and I want to buy in Naples or Palm Beach, I can pick up the phone and call the top brokers there. And when you arrive, you have somebody that's going to give you instant access to the best information and the best listings. So it's it's the industry standard for luxury presentation for waterfront properties and all types of luxury properties.
And I can say, stand up with that as, Rate is a preferred partner, white glove partner for Sotheby's in the DMV area, and always top-notch service that we get from all the agents there.
Yeah, it's we have a whole suite of services that we're affiliated with. Rate does a tremendous job with the loan side, and I think if you compare the brokerages around the world, you'll find that nothing compares to Sotheby's.
Let's we're going to turn it a little bit to the lending side here a little bit. I'm going to ask you about when you're working with lenders like myself, what do you think is the difference between a deal that closes and a deal that falls apart? What are the things that you're looking for on the lending side?
Yeah, so it's really hard to get through the sales process and get a contract in hand, and everybody's excited. Hey, we've got a contract on our house, and I always tell my sellers, hey, I hope the lender is as good as Pat. You need to have a good lender in place because contract to closing is the hardest part of the business. And when you have a good lender that's not learning at your expense, that has 25 plus years of experience, you're going to get to the finish line and it's going to be low stress. And you're not going to, run into any deadlines. A lot of times with lending, if a lender has too much work and not enough bandwidth, they'll get the contract, they won't order the appraisal, they won't start the underwriting, and all of a sudden we're getting calls as the realtor saying, I don't know if we're going to hit the deadline. I don't know if we're going to meet settlement. So, I've found over the years that a good lender really knows their craft and they understand the buyer's goal is not to get in there and roll their sleeves up and be involved. They just want to receive the loan with the least amount of stress on time.
Right. Yeah, and I think a lot of times too, lenders miss the mark is not communicating too, right?
Yeah, communication. Yeah,
it's you don't need to know everything throughout the process, every little nook and cranny of things. But if there is a potential issue, we get the word out sooner. We get the agents involved so that it's not. I think a lot of times when we have time to work on things and agents can help us for whatever the problem might be, we work together and we make it happen. But I know that no one appreciates, 3 days before closing saying, hey, we have a problem when we could have been handling those things before. So we try to really focus in on communication and understand that, like you said, bandwidth and being able to handle things. I think that's where we've been able to kind of mix, really good people. I have awesome people that I work with that, a team that is, that I fully trust. And the technology that we're growing. I mean, we know, the AI. I mean, everything's gotten. It's such a huge jump over the last few years that I think we were able to blend the technology along with the really good people doing things. So, great to hear on that. Let's talk about. We kind of maybe got a little into this, and your knowledge of building and construction, I think, is huge with this. When you're working with a buyer and they're doing a home inspection on a waterfront property. What are some of the biggest red flags that if you see this with a buyer you're working with, you're saying this needs to be addressed?
Right. Well, with a waterfront property, we're always looking at, the significant systems, right? So, septic is probably the number one, red flag. If there's a failure of a septic system on a waterfront property, it sometimes cannot be easily fixed. It has to be permitted. If the lender catches wind of it, right? They might not want to loan on a property that doesn't have a functioning septic. Erosion is huge. Erosion is extremely expensive, especially with waterfront. If it's happening at the water's edge, it could be hundreds of thousands of dollars. A buyer is looking to enjoy the property and sit back and have a cocktail and watch the sunset. They're not planning to hire a contractor on day one and spend $200,000 on a shoreline, protection. Radon and mold, any health-related, findings, lead-based paint. And then I think overall, depending on the age of the structure, has it been maintained? Because living on the water, with the wind and the moisture, and there's more wear and tear on a home. And if you have a really nice home that's not well maintained, it could be a money pit. You could be stepping into every day something's breaking.
Right.
Because it takes a fair amount of time and investment to maintain a waterfront property.
Let's maybe talk about getting into a recent client experience. Obviously, no addresses, no names, but can you think of a recent scenario where your expertise in understanding real estate, understanding waterfront, really made the difference for your clients?
I feel like that happens. We do about 100 transactions a year, and I think we have 10 closings this month. So that's where I think, as a professional that leads this industry in the waterfront market, my experience in getting through challenges in the smoothest way, we have, just as of last week, we had a septic system fail, and the seller was supposed to fix it prior to settlement. The guy came out and said, hey, we've got to take out a 80-foot tree to get access to it, and the tree provides privacy, and it was a double-digit transactions, super high-value property. And so I went back to the contractor and said, hey, can you meet me out there? And I met him, and he said, yeah, well, we have a workaround. We could do this, we could do that. Called the seller, called the buyer's agent. Buyer said, sure, let's do it. And, the deal settled on time. And it didn't cost my client anything, as far as they didn't have to, lose a tree, potentially lose a transaction, and still have to make the repair. So my goal is to not fumble at the 1 yard line. It's hard enough to find a buyer that likes your property, to negotiate to terms that work for both parties, to get to the finish line. And that's, often in real estate, you hear horror stories because sometimes there were solutions that weren't found, and then you're forced to bring a property back to market. So that's the worst thing you can ever have is a listing that, goes back to market.
Look, I'm going to ask you to put on your future prediction hat here now.
Yeah.
Look at, and we're going to talk about 12 to 18 months. And even before we went on the podcast here, you and I were talking about mortgage rates. So let's assume that a lot of folks are thinking, especially now with some recent information that's come out, let's say we see mortgage rates come down a point from where they are today in the next 12 to 18 months. Where do you see housing in general, but maybe even going into waterfront areas, how does that impact what you'll see out there? And the reason I ask that really is that I personally believe mortgage rates are going to have a positive impact on home prices rising in general. But I always know we talk about some of the higher dollar purchase prices. A lot of those clients are working with cash. So I wondered do you think it's as impactful for the waterfront as it would be for, inland properties that are not luxury?
Yeah. Well, the caveat I'll say is I tell all of my clients, when you hear anything about the housing market in the news, it's like a national weather report. It's not local. I'm hyper focused on the local waterfront market, which is so different than even DC or Naples, Florida, or La Jolla. I mean, they're all very different. In our local market, of our transactions, our average sale price is $2.6 million. That's about what we average on the listing side. We know that 2/3 of our buyers finance their homes. So this is not a cash-driven market, and we never have international buyers here. So the thought of buyers coming from China or overseas, it doesn't happen. So it's a local market that's basically the average sales in the 2 million range, and they're financing these homes. So they are rate driven, but most of these buyers, they don't live or die on a point. But what they do pay attention to is the narrative that they hear in the news, right? The news, if it sounds like, the housing market's struggling, rates are at a 20-year high like we had 2 years ago. There's a lot of, inventories picking up. demand is down, then they're more likely not to buy. But I think as the rates come down and the narrative changes, and they're saying that the rates are coming down. I know a week ago they were at a 6-week low.
Right.
I've been telling my clients that, right? And that starts to make sense. The stock market, a lot of my clients that are buyers in this upper price, the top tier properties, they're market driven, right? So the market this year has had a tumultuous up and down, but it's pretty much doing what it should do right now. I think it's at 7 or 8% year to date. It's not great, but it's not bad. And so if you have rates coming down, a stable stock market, I think buyers that have been looking for a retirement home, they're going to become serious buyers, because the big thing about waterfront property is nobody needs a waterfront property. It's always going to be a discretionary purchase, right? They aspire to living on the water, right? They want their kids to visit, so they're going to buy an anchor house, a grandparent, hub, or they're going to leave DC and get out of the hustle and bustle and live on the water in a sanctuary, or they have a boat and they're tired of paying for a marina and they want to walk out to their boat from the property. Those are all needs. They don't have to have that.
Right.
So when it comes to a rate, whether it's 5% or 6%, if they're at the time of their life when they're ready to do it, they're going to do it. But we don't have the impulsive buyers in the market that we had during COVID, where people were just racing out of the cities and just snatching up whatever they could.
It's 3%. The money's free, basically.
Yeah. So now we have high prices and rates coming down. The market was somewhat stagnant a couple of years ago when the rates really hit the high point, because we had the COVID high level prices, max prices. Cost of money was at the top, and inventory was still very low. So it's like a buyer would say, let's go look at homes. You're like, well, there's not many for sale. They're really expensive, and the loan's going to be expensive.
Yeah.
So we just need some, I think, headwind, that to go away, and we can get kind of, a good narrative in the news, like, hey, rates are coming down. The problem with that, as is that means buyers are going to get off the sideline, which is going to be more competition. So if you're a buyer waiting for rates to come down, to buy your home, that's a terrible plan, because I don't think we're going to see any drop in prices. Our prices aren't coming down anytime soon, and if the cost of money comes down, the buyers that are waiting are going to be in the market, and they end up having to overpay for the home instead of getting a slightly higher mortgage rate today and having less competition. That's really what's going on behind the scenes, and smart buyers know that.
Yeah.
They're out now going, all right, well, the house I could have bought in 2019 is $1 million. Now I got to pay $2 million. If I wait 5 more years, it'll be, 2.5.
Yeah, I mean, that's the conversation. I feel like I have that conversation just about every day when, Pat, what do you think is going to happen with rates, and or home prices? And I ask the question, I make it pretty simple. Hey, if rates come down, what do you think is going to happen to home prices? If you think they're going to come down, the only way that would make any sense would be there's going to be this flood of inventory that's going to come on the market. I do believe that there'll be more inventory that will come on, because people that are in those sub 3% rates maybe would put it on, but no way is it going to outrun the number of buyers that are going to come off the sideline to do that. And I think it's also, I think you made a really good point about the sentiment that you see, on the news, online, wherever people are consuming their information. And we know that's, who knows what this kind of thing. And taking a national perspective is never a good idea, because every market's localized. I mean, it does, don't compare it to what's going on in Florida or Texas or Vegas. This is don't even compare this to what's happening in Baltimore or Montgomery County. This is a very specialized, market, and it acts that way. And a lot of times we all have to overcome the clickbait that people see, that want to get eyeballs on articles. And
exactly.
If you followed some of the people that are in the news for the last 15 years, you would have never bought a house. And every year they were gloom and doom. And even when home prices were going up 20%, they were still saying home price, the sky was falling. So don't listen to those things. Listen to this guy. He's telling you the straight facts. So Brad, I always, I watch these podcasts, and I find that every podcast seems to have this rapid fire questions they got to throw at the guest, and maybe not as related to what the topics were. So I'd like to do that. Are you up for some rapid fire questions?
Yeah, sure.
All right. So let's go. Number one. We've been talking a lot about waterfront homes, but we haven't talked about boats.
Oh, no.
What's the dream boat, Brad? What is the boat that you aspire at someday to have? And you're talking to a guy. First, this guy here is a novice boater. I just ride on people's boats and enjoy a good time with that. But I'd love to pontificate here for me.
All right, so rapid fire is tough on this because I have 3 boats now, and you need a boat for every activity. I would say boating and time is the big question. What type of boat and how much time do you have? Right. If I had the choice at this moment and I didn't have to attend to my real estate practice, I would get a Norhaven 120. Okay. Which is Norhaven is the yacht maker that has more boats circumnavigating the world than any other boat. They're a all oceans blue water boat, but they only go 6 knots. So you better have time. Right. You could leave today and get to go to England, but you better have 3 weeks. You know?
Right.
Yeah.
So so finding the time for yourself, that's the challenge for you,
so
right?
Now I want a fast boat.
Right.
Because I want to be able to go out and come back quickly.
Yeah, you need to be able to get to England and back fast in one day because you got a showing. You got a showing to do. All right, well, let's stay on the water here. When you're out on the boat, when you do find time to be out with family, friends, what's your favorite place to dine on the water? And you can give me a couple. 2 or 3. Where are your go-to spots?
The simplest is just to go to Ego Alley and tie up and go to Chop Tank. Okay. Sit on the upper deck, overlook the harbor. Great Annapolis spot. If we're going for an hour cruise, we'll pop over to St. Michael's. Go out to Ava's is our favorite pizza place.
I love St. Michael's, and Ava's is phenomenal.
And then I would say the other place that's super fun we've been going to a lot this year is going up to Harbor East in downtown Baltimore. Okay. Sometimes we'll go up and go to a Ravens game. We'll go up and go to a Pier 6 concert. And there's Atlas has great restaurants right there at the harbor. That's a fun little hour-long boat trip as well. So
yeah, I did a last year with a buddy. We went to an Orioles game. Yeah, and we went to Harbor East.
It's the way to go.
Yeah, I mean, I'm like, I don't ever want to drive and park in a parking lot again. I only want to go by water to an Orioles game. All right, so let's, as a lifelong Marylander, Old Bay on your crabs or Old Bay on everything?
I would say it's a select. I like Old Bay. We had a seafood business, right? We had 4 seafood markets. I spent a lot of summer steaming crabs. Yesterday I put Old Bay on cantaloupe. I don't know. That's a local thing.
I actually hadn't heard that, but
that's a good one. Just try it.
Yeah, I'm gonna try it.
But yeah, I'd say put on everything. Yeah.
Okay. Very interesting, all the different things. I knew some of the stuff some of your background, but hearing all the different jobs that you have is just really cool. As I said before, I love hearing the origin stories of everybody. But if you weren't doing real estate, what would you be doing instead right now?
Great question. I always tell this makes me think of most of my clients, when I first meet them and I walk into their home, they have a dog. And, dogs I feel like every listing has a dog these days. And I always tell them, look, I like dogs more than people. It's my thing. I have a golden retriever. And so I think I would do something with nature, whether it's a park ranger or something where I'm interacting with animals versus people. It's kind of, I find a lot of comfort and serenity being around wildlife and animals. And we visit Costa Rica almost every year. So I think that would be, I don't have a specific profession, maybe a tour guide. I don't know.
Right. Something that would also give you time to take the 3-week trip to wherever and do that. Brad, what we're going to wrap up here. I want you to let the audience know what the best way to reach you would be. Social medias, things like that. How do people reach you?
Great question. So Brad Kappel, KAPPEL.com, my website. We have a tremendous social media platform. Unfortunately, my cell phone number is on every single website, on earth. If you search my name or Waterfront. I always pick up my phone. I think that's a lost art. I know, Pat, you always do. People say, God, I can't believe you answered your phone. But, that was the way I was raised. And, I'm proactive.
it's an amazing thing that it's weird that people that you pick up your phone and just don't want to text. But I always crack me up when I get people that don't have voicemails anymore. Yeah, it must be a young person thing. I must be too old to understand that. I'm like, I'm in a job where I want to talk to people and I don't leave a voicemail. I always find that strange. Well, thanks for joining us. I'm Pat Gannon with Rate, and this has been another episode of Hanging with Gannon. If today's conversation got you thinking about waterfront living, reach out to both of us. We'd love to help you make that dream a reality. Thanks for being on the podcast, Brad, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks, Pat.